Hey guys, how's it going? Long time no talk. If you don't follow me on Instagram, you probably don't know that I have been sick for the past 2 weeks, like super sick. You might be able to tell still from my voice. I finally got my voice back, which was super exciting. There were like probably 5 days there where I could manage no sound other than a whisper. I didn't really film or do anything. I spent a lot of time sleeping and hydrating. So, trying to get back into the swing of things, and I'm gonna start with a January wrap up. Because I was so sick, before I got really sick, I was just kind of like feeling meh, so I did end up doing a lot of reading. This is a particularly reading-full month. So I opened up January with the hashtag DTProject17. I will leave a link to that in the description box down below. I'm reading the Dark Tower series. Alongside of it, I'm reading some supplementary texts, and one of the texts that I read was Childe, Roland to the Dark Tower Came, the poem by Robert Browning. I just read it out of my Norton anthology, and it was fun. It was fun to kind of go back and to reread something that I hadn't read since my first year of university, so oh my god, like 6 years ago now. It was just kind of fun to pull apart some of the imagery, to look up some of the references, and it led me on this sort of spiral into fairy tales and resulted in me reading Childe, Roland, the fairy tale, which was pretty cool. This was a nice, easy way to start off January. Again, following along with the Dark Tower read-along, I read The Little Sisters of Eluria, which is a short story by Stephen King in the collection Everything's Eventual. It gives us a peek into Roland's adventures before he goes on the quest for the Dark Tower that we see in the Gunslinger. Unfortunately, written later than the Gunslinger, so that Stephen King's writing style has changed, and I guess the series has sort of changed and gotten better, and I liked the short story so much. Roland goes into this small town, weird things are happening, and he's saved by some nuns. Are they good? Are they bad? I don't know. It was great, it was fun, and it had me looking forward to reading the series, which then made reading The Gunslinger by Stephen King particularly disappointing. A video that I filmed before I was sick but haven't edited yet will be going up, or might already be up. I'll link that down below as well if you're interested, for my thoughts on The Gunslinger. But yes, after reading the short story, The Gunslinger was a disappointment. So The Gunslinger is Roland's journey to find the Man in Black and talk to him about how to proceed with his quest for the Dark Tower. It's very slow-paced, not something that I would continue with. So many people tell me to just push through because the series goes into weird and wacky and wonderful places, and overall it is a fun reading experience. So I'm still holding on, guys. I'm still holding on. The next book I read, I also have a review that is filmed prior to me getting sick, but I haven't edited yet, and that is Her Every Fear by Peter Swanson. Now, I was sent an advance copy of this. Unfortunately, it came out like 2 days after I received the package from work, so I didn't make it in time, but I do have a review for it now. So this is the story of Cait, a very anxious British woman who switches places with her cousin in the States, and then a woman in that apartment complex is murdered, and everything sort of unfolds. I didn't super love this for reasons that I go into more in depth in the review, but let me just say that I'm not a huge fan of mental illness as the new thing for making an automatic, unreliable narrator. Like with the train of books that have followed Gone Girl and Girl on the Train, it seems like the easiest way to make somebody unreliable is to just make them mentally ill and to sort of write them off as a reliable source of information because of that mental illness. And I'm not a huge fan of that. I'm not a huge fan of that narrative trend. The next book that I read was The Hate U Give by Angie Thomas. This, again, is an advanced reader's copy that I received through work. This one comes out February 14th, 2017, I believe. This is the story of 16-year-old Star Carter, whose friend dies in a police shooting, simply because he is Black. It's very topical, it's very cognizant of intersecting oppressions being in her head. It takes all of these things that I've sort of been absorbing from like Twitter and Tumblr and the news, and it brings them into this narrative through this character that I felt close with because I was reading from her perspective, and I feel like it opens us up to be more empathetic to different positions than our own. There are some passages in here that I would love to quote from, I would love to read you, which I might do in my review. I do plan on buying a copy of this, and then once I've bought a copy, I will do a full review because I do want to read a couple of passages, but you're not allowed to quote from an arc. So, soon to come, but this was phenomenal, and I highly, highly recommend that you pick it up when it comes out. Even if you're not into YA, if you are at all interested in the world, in alternative perspectives, in doing some diverse reading, this is the book that you should read. So the next book that I consumed was How to Build a Girl by Caitlin Moran. This I listened to on audiobook. The story was hilarious. It was like the best thing ever. So I listened to this audiobook while doing inventory for work. It was hilarious. It was amazing. The story is so good and so relatable if you have ever been a young teenage human trying to figure out life, which I'm sure that if you're an adult, most of you have, unless you've somehow managed to skip that and your teenage years were absolutely perfect. The only thing is I hated the audiobook recording for two reasons. Firstly, the narrator cannot do an Irish accent. I was under the impression that the one character was Indian based on her accent, and I was like, oh, this is a really weird kind of racist thing to do. Like, this is a really bad Indian accent. And then I realized that the character that she was trying to give an accent to was supposed to be Irish. That's how bad the accent was. Like, honestly, just skip the accent if you can't do it. The other thing that was really bad is that the audio wasn't adjusted, so the narrator would sort of whisper hushed things to you, and then at the same time, a couple of paragraphs later, would portray the drunken dad yelling. Like, it was hard to listen to at a comfortable volume where, because the narrator kept like trailing off into whispers and then shouting bits. So I would not recommend the audio recording. Avoid that at all costs if you can. Read the book because the story is phenomenal. The next thing that I read was Unmentionable by Therese O'Neill. This is the Victorian Lady's Guide to Sex, Marriage, and Manners. It is historical, basically like toilet stuff. So like the existence of crotchless underwear for like most of the Victorian era because you were wearing so much damn fabric and those wires to make your dress bow out, so that like pulling your dress up to take your underpants off was not an option, so everything was crotchless. Just discussions of sex and marriage and expectations for women in relationships, how basically everything wrong with women came back to their reproductive system, and there was really no way to be a healthy woman, because if you were like happy and plump, you had something wrong with you, and if you were thin and sickly, you had something wrong with you. So there was no winning as a Victorian woman, and it was just the dry humor of this was fantastic. So I had to relocate slightly because my camera battery was dying. Now we're plugged in, we're gold. Let us continue. After Therese O'Neill, I can't remember what happened, but I was feeling kind of down. And so I picked up an old favorite, Alanna the First Adventure by Tamora Pierce. This is the story of Alanna, who switches places with her twin, Tom. Tom doesn't want to go be a knight, and Alanna doesn't want to go be a lady, so they swap places so that Tom can go into the city and learn sorcery, and Alanna can go to the palace and train to be a knight. Alanna is, of course, hiding her gender because women are not allowed to be warriors. This is her first sort of adventure into this old man's world. She becomes more comfortable with herself and her magic because she too has the gift. It's a really fun book, but reading it again, I have been a little more critical of it. I have such fond memories of this as a kid, and it's still fun, it's still nostalgic, but it's Tamora Pierce's first book. It's her first story. So having just spent a year studying Protector of the Small, which is one of her later books, Protector of the Small is a much stronger text in terms of the writing and the characterization and the development of the plot and just transitioning between plot elements. So this is still super fun, and I would highly recommend that you check this out, that you get into Tortall. And it is nice to start at the beginning. You have to be prepared that this is a first novel. That's the one thing that I'd like to reflect on, because I do mention these books so often on this channel. You do have to remember that it is a first book. Then, because the Netflix series was coming out, I of course read The Bad Beginning by Lemony Snicket, and then we devoured the Netflix series, which was phenomenal. I loved it. Neil Patrick Harris is a god. You should watch it. That has to be one of my favorites from January, is the Series of Unfortunate Events Netflix adaptation. This is about the Baudelaire orphans and them sort of getting shuffled around to different guardians, including Count Olaf in the first one, who just wants to steal their fortune in any way possible. They almost read as a parody of children's literature, just in terms of the overly didactic elements, like the constant need to define words, like the use of big words, and then the straightforward definition of them. I would love to do a sort of study of this in a children's literature course at some point. But yeah, it was really fun, and I never read them as a kid, but I did enjoy reading it as an adult, so this was fun. The next thing that I read, purely because of the controversy, I did not pay for it because I did not want to support it. I borrowed it from work, and that is Carve the Mark by Veronica Roth. I was hearing things about it being racist and ableist, and I wanted to form those opinions for myself, and having read it, I do agree that it is sort of problematic to have the good guys appear light-skinned and the savage race of aliens appear dark-skinned. I feel like we could probably do with a little bit more nuance, especially because I don't think that that's ever really complicated in an interesting enough way. I guess if you wanted to set up that dichotomy, just based on our real world politics and our current racist narratives, if you wanted to do that but then challenge it, it would be a totally different story. But I've read the whole book. I didn't DNF this. I did get to the end, and I really don't feel like the dark-skinned savage race was adequately challenged, or that the light-skinned good guys was subverted in any way. We had a little bit of white savior stuff happening. The idea of pain being a gift. What? Chronic pain is not a gift. The idea that she deserves her chronic pain, also not cool. The incredibly detailed descriptions of self-harm, if you've ever self-harmed, are probably not a good thing to read. And then overall, in terms of world building, it was weak. Like, I mean, every text can have problems, and unintentional problems, because if you put a text out to a certain beta readership, like a very homogenous beta readership, you're probably not going to have people picking up on these things. I'm not really sure who the beta readership is here, but I think this is a prime example of why it is important to offer your text up to as many voices as possible to get your feedback before you get to this point. So my point being that there can always be unintentional implications of what you write if it's not your position, and that's okay. The thing is, it's also a sloppy story. It has really poor world building. Like, there were some half-assed attempts to create some sort of metric system, but like nothing else. There's very little other world building. The saving grace of this book, if we want to pull out one thing, is that Kira, whatever the main female character's name is, the main female character is a strong female character, definitely admirable, definitely has some very appealing qualities. Everything else sort of falls flat. Then I read Hermelin, the Detective Mouse, as told by Minnie Gray. This is a picture book that I picked up from work. It is, of course, about Hermelin, the mouse detective, and his adventures as he solves mysteries that happen in the apartment complex. What drew me to this was the illustrations, which I thought were really cute. I thought it was really adorable, and it was a fun read. Then one of my friends at work gave me a copy of The Sandman by Neil Gaiman. This is volume 1, Preludes and Nocturnes. So this is the story of the King of Dreams as he tries to collect his items that have been stolen from him and sort of re-establish his dream kingdom. So he escapes his captivity and he returns to the world and sort of rights things. My friend who gave this to me works in the children's department, and like based on the other things that she's recommended to me, I wasn't quite expecting this. I guess that just goes to show how diverse people's reading tastes can be. Like it's quite dark, very gritty. The art style is very compelling. Like I loved looking at the art as I went through. It's not quite as like poppy or colorful as the other graphic novels that I've been reading, which was kind of nice. I'm definitely interested in reading the rest of the series. So I'm really thankful that she gave this to me and that she recommended this to me because I had a really great time reading it. Then I finished up Closer, Notes from the Orgasmic Frontier of Female Sexuality by Sarah Barmak. This is a piece of Canadian literature published by Coach House Books in Toronto. And it sort of collects all of the data and research and workshops and stuff that are going on around female sexuality currently. So it's a very current text. And so it sort of looks at sex and desire and how we think about these things and how we diagnose these things. If you're at all interested in the research that's being done out there on female sexuality, highly recommend this. It's a quick read and it gives you a nice little reading list if you're interested in reading beyond this book, which is pretty cool. Next, I read The Shadow of What Was Lost by James Islington. This is the first book in a fantasy series. You can definitely see the influences of Brandon Sanderson and Robert Jordan in here, at least I can. It is a really fun story. We have sort of 3 narrative perspectives that diverge and come back together. We have Davian, who is gifted but unable to use his gift for reasons. We have Weir, who is gifted and Davian's friend, and then we have Asha, who is again gifted and part of this group at the university. Something really terrible happens at the university. Davian and Weir go off on this journey by themselves. They get separated from Asha, and they're trying to figure out what is going on. So there's this magical barrier that's keeping out sort of the darker elements. And society is really divided between the gifted and the non-gifted. The non-gifted have set up these tenets that the gifted are magically bound to so that they're unable to use their magic to harm. It was a little long-winded in places. This is the first book in a series that was originally self-published and has now been picked up by Orbit. So from what I understand, this is the original self-published text. I imagine with the editing team of Orbit, these books will become a little more streamlined. So the ideas are cool, the adventure is cool, it's checking all my boxes in terms of what I like from fantasy. It's a little too long at this point, and I can see it getting better in the future with professional editing. The next thing that I read, because yes, this pile still keeps going, was Simon versus the Homo Sapiens Agenda by Becky Albertalli. So this was recommended by so many of my coworkers. It tells the story of Simon, a young gay boy who hasn't come out to anyone yet. So one day at school, he forgets to log out from his email where he's been emailing back and forth with another boy that he met online. Someone goes on the computer after him and sees these, and they start blackmailing him with these emails, and it sort of goes off from there. It was a quick read, it was a fun read, it was a funny read, and a really touching read as well. Some criticism, there aren't just queer characters existing being queer, they always seem to be in coming out narratives, which isn't the only thing that queer people do. What I think is a pro for this is the idea of cyberbullying and how you might handle that situation. So it's not just a coming out narrative, it touches on how social media can play into that, not only with finding a community online and finding support online, but the sort of dangers of social media and how we might deal with that in an appropriate way. So I would recommend that you check this book out. The next book that I read was book 4 in the Amulet series. This is a graphic novel series for 9 to 12-year-olds. and this is called The Last Council. So in this one, we find out that the person that Emily and friends have teamed up with is not exactly who he appears to be, and things go awry. That's all I really want to say, because, I mean, we're mid-series now, and I feel like actually going into the plot would spoil things if you're interested in picking it up. The art is beautiful. I think the representation of gender and questions of power and agency in the series are interesting. I have some questions about power and agency still, and I'm curious to see how things turn out in the end, and perhaps at the end I will do a discussion of gender, power, and agency and ask some questions here, because I've learned something in the later books that sort of complicates gender, power, and agency, and I think it's important to perhaps unpack that a little bit. Put a pin in this and we'll come back to it later. So the second last thing I read is Girls and Sex by Peggy Orenstein. This is a teen parenting book. The way I phrase that sounds like teen parents will be reading this. It's for parents who have teenagers. And I picked this up because I am still researching for my Sex and YA series. I found this super interesting and super helpful. I think the most compelling thing about this that helps me sort of make sense of sex and YA for myself is this. Quote, "You'd be foolish to think that teens are not getting ideas from porn. Young people are not blank slates. They have a sense of right and wrong. But if they're repeatedly exposed to certain themes, they are more likely to pick them up, to internalize them, and have them become a part of their sexual scripts. Young people are internalizing the things that we give them as examples for how they should behave." The point being that if we are providing alternative examples of acceptable, consensual, appropriate, pleasurable behavior in the texts that young people are consuming, including young adult literature, they are perhaps more likely to emulate these in their real life. Having a sex scene like the sex scene in The Fault in Our Stars, where there is consent, there is mention of protection with the condomy awkwardness, and there's pleasure, it provides a better example than perhaps porn would, where these things are often absent. This text was super interesting and super helpful. I did borrow it from work, but I am planning on buying my own copy. The paperbacks for these come out, I believe, March 7th. So if you are interested in thinking through sex and teens and our current culture and how our culture affects young women, because she does interview, I think it's 70 something young women, so people a little bit younger than myself. She's looking at young women in the last few years of high school and university. But to read the things that the people that she interviewed were saying, the ideas that they have, the dissonance and the disconnect between the ideas that young women have and their behavior. It seems like a lot of young women have internalized this girl power idea, but then when it actually comes to performance, they don't follow through. They fall back on these kind of sexist scripts. And so the book is sort of thinking through and marking that disconnect, which is interesting to think about. And it's given me a lot to think about. I would highly recommend that you read it. If you have read it, I would love to discuss it, because there are a couple of things that I'm a little bit iffy about. And finally, yes, if you made it to the end of the video, pat yourself on the back. The last thing I read before I got really, really sick and just stopped reading things and became a slug that watched 3 seasons of Switched at Birth was Amulet Book 5, Prince of the Elves. This gives us context. This goes back in time, and it gives us some context for the world. This is our world building book, and it was glorious, and it's purple, and it made me happy. I'm so excited to read the rest of the series. I'm not gonna pick up that stack of books. Trust me, it's a big impressive stack. I read a lot of things. This is what happens when you're too diseased to go out and engage with other humans. You spend a lot of time by yourself reading all the things. Let me know in the comments down below what your favorite read in January was. If you stuck around, thank you so much. I have no idea what this is gonna look like when it's edited down. I think I've been here for like a good hour just filming. I hope you are healthy and happy and that you are enjoying your February. I guess I should mention that because I have been sick, I haven't done any of the top 5 Wednesdays. Not really sure if that's gonna happen this month. We shall see. I'm going to go respond to all of your lovely comments. Connect with me on social media. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you soon. Bye.